Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adam Smith, part two. Um, I wanted to start by talking about the labor theory of value. So today we're gonna read a few quotes, a few passages, right? So last time we didn't read almost any quotes, just a few excerpts, just a few bits. But today we'll do a bit more of that, so you get to hear Adam Smith, right, saying for himself some of the things we've discussed, but also things we haven't talked about. So in order to complement and in order to give a little bit of more illustration about what we were talking about. So last time we talked about the fact that Adam Smith is forever associated with the idea of the invisible hand. And he uses that expression actually in both books. Okay, so I mentioned the theory of moral sentiments, right? And we talked mostly about the wealth of nations. And actually, he does use the expression, the invisible hand, in both books, although he only uses it once in each book, he does use it in both books. So that's maybe the most famous idea of his there. But another concept, or in theory rather than a concept, the labor theory of value, is also present in Adam Smith, and it's a very important theory. We've already encountered it very briefly, not explicitly, but implicitly with John Locke. So John Locke is belongs to the prehistory of the labor theory of value. Okay, he's not explicitly part of that tradition. He's writing before Adam Smith, before the Industrial Revolution, so he's not yet thinking about the idea that prices come from labor, right? The idea that the more you work, the higher the price of something. That's essentially what the labor theory of value is trying to answer to the question of where do prices come from, right? Where does value come from, and therefore where does price come from? And the labor theory of value is the first attempt to, there are the first attempts, I should say, because there's Adam Smith, there's Karl Marx, there's David Ricardo, there's a bunch of people. And in a preliminary sense, there's John Locke as well, right, who are trying to associate price with amount of labor. So if there are even, let's assume two societies of hunters, okay, hunter gatherers, and they trade, let's imagine, okay, one tribe hunts deers and one tribe hunts buffalo. Okay, it's harder to catch a deer because they are fast and right relative to a buffalo, which is slower. I'm not entirely sure that's accurate, but I'm just imagining that's the case. Let's assume that's the case. It doesn't really matter. It's just an abstraction. I could say X and Y, but I don't like to, some people, it's not my issue, but some people don't like algebra and abstraction. So let's imagine, right? Some animals, because Adam Smith and Karl Marx and David Ricardo, the classical economists, when they're talking about labor theory of value, they use these examples of hunter gatherers. Okay. And basically, the argument is okay, so if it takes me 2 days to hunt a deer because it's a little bit hard, and it takes you just one day to hunt a buffalo because it's a bit easier, right? So I'm going to exchange one deer for two buffaloes, okay? Because it takes, right? If it takes me twice the time, then the price should be twice as high, right? That's essentially the labor theory of value in a very, very simplified version. Of course, again, Marx will develop it in a different way than Adam Smith and Ricardo, but they all share similarities, and they're trying to answer this question. And the thrust of the argument is that it is labor that generates value. And I mentioned John Locke because when John Locke talks about, and we've discussed this before, what is it that makes private property legitimate? He argues that it is the fact that we mix our own labor, right, with the labor of God, essentially, he's saying, with providence, with raw materials, nature itself. Nature provides us raw materials when we work, right? So when you hunt, right? you can claim that deer because you worked for it. So God or nature, providence provides the natural world for us, provides half of the equation, if you will, and then we work, right? We work on the land and we hunt and we do whatever it is, and we gain the legitimacy, okay, of the ability to claim private property, whether it's a deer or a piece of land or the fruits of trees, etc., because we worked for it, right? If someone works for it, then it would be unfair that a second person, it would be illegitimate that a second person comes and collects the deer that the other person has hunt, isn't it? So Locke essentially starts saying that, starts thinking something along these lines, right? Of the labor theory of value. Now, this, what you're seeing here is very interesting because this is a true check that was used in the early 19th century, just for 3 years here. You can see 27 to 30, but essentially there was this experiment in the United States where people try to get rid of money, a little bit like Bitcoin today, right? To have a different alternative mean of exchange. So it looks like money here in cash, right? But you can see that it's inspired in the labor theory of value. And basically what they thought is, what if we get rid of cash, and what we can do instead is we can exchange stuff and pay each other with rights over labor time. Okay, basically here, what's happening is this person called Joseph Peters is buying something from Sarah Johnson, whatever it is. So let's assume he bought pasta. Okay, I like eating pasta, so that's the first thing that came to my mind. So he buys pasta from Sarah. Sarah produces all kinds of pasta, spaghetti, right? Gnocchi, lasagna, everything you can think of. So um, Joseph, um, Joseph, he is a carpenter, okay, and Sarah, she produces pasta, right? That's just the first example that came to mind. So he will tell Sarah, okay, I want 10 kilos of spaghetti, 5 kilos of lasagna, yeah, 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 okay? And since there's no money here in this society, and this is actually, as I mentioned, it's not an abstraction that actually happened for a few years in the United States. It was limited, right? There was a store, etc., that was trying to work this way, kind of the utopian socialists. If you heard about utopian socialists, and I mentioned that briefly when we talked about Rousseau, there were a few utopian socialist experiments in the US where people try to create these, sort of not communist. Okay, that's why it's called utopian socialism, because it's different from socialism and communism, but it's kind of an alternative society here, right? You see, without money, without the government, kind of, where basically they would exchange directly, right? The labor of one person for the labor of the other one. So Joseph gives Sarah this check, and whenever Sarah needs 3 hours worth of labor in carpentry work, because that's what Joseph does, she can request that from him, okay, for him to build her a chair or whatever it is. And then you see here, or 3 12 pounds of corn. Corn is the closest to cash in other terms. Like, if, why is this? Because, well, what happens if Sarah never needs, right, the carpenter's work? It might turn out that, or maybe she will need a chair in 10 years from now, whatever, right? It might happen. So there, some people in this community here will produce things that you only need once in a while, right? So they give this opportunity that in the case that she doesn't need a carpenter's work, she can also ask Joseph Peters for 3 12 pounds of corn. Okay, corn has been used as money, right? And multiple things have been used as money in antiquity all the way up to, right, modern times, until we started using gold, etc. Right. Um, so there was this second, possibility, just in case, in case a person needs liquidity. So there was some kind of cash still, which was corn here, right? Everything could be exchanged in corn as well. So that was kind of how we use gold and bronze and silver, right? Corn could substitute for that as well. Okay, it could work to replace these units, right? So that's why you also have corn here. But essentially, right? So Sarah would use the carpenter's work of Joseph. Joseph would each person would contribute, etc., etc. So you see here, cost, the limit of price, right? Justice. So many people associated this idea, and Marx would take this up, of course, this idea that all value comes from labor. Okay, so it would be fair. Some people argue, right, that at the end of the day, all value goes back to labor. If it is labor power only that generates value, right? Then some people could argue that it would be the correct thing to do is that whoever worked for it, right, appropriates it. So that's what people are trying to do here, trying to get away with profits and companies, etc. Right? People negotiating directly. So in theory, because if Joseph works for a company, right, he produces a table, but part of that value goes to the owner of the company, right? That's Karl Marx's objection that we'll see later. And here he gets to keep the whole value of that which he produces. So that's what some people try to do in the US, but it didn't work out. It was short-lived, but it's an interesting experience, and I recommend you Google Cincinnati Times Store if you want to know a little bit more about this story. But it is a perfect crystallization of the labor theory of value. All right. Main ideas of the book, and just so you have a sketch, okay, an overview of the argument. So the main first chapters of the book discuss the fact that the division of labor is limited by the size of markets, right? So trade is not a zero-sum game, it's a positive sum game, because the more trade you have, the more division of labor you have, right? If your country is not trading with anyone, so if you're Norway, remember I mentioned that Norway or Denmark and Sweden, they are good at, it's very cold, so they'll be good at some stuff, right? Like salmon and certain kind of fish that are cold water fish. But they're not going to be good in other things that are easily produced in Africa or South America, where it's warmer, right? So if Sweden is completely isolated, doesn't trade, they cannot specialize in certain things, right? They need to produce everything that they need, isn't it? So the more trade you have, the more division of labor you have, and the more wealth you have. Okay, at least on the aggregate. All right. So that's the first chapter. Then how he starts the book. I mean, the trade makes division of labor possible, but it is the division of labor which explains and generates the wealth of nations. Okay, sure, it's the division of labor. It's true that it requires trade, but it's not trade. Okay, it's not trade that makes you rich, like mercantilists thought. It's the division of labor, right? It's the fact that you have the pen factory and people working together in the factory rather than you trying to do everything yourself. So mass consumption and more markets, the bigger the markets, the more division of labor, the wealthier nations would get. That's why Adam Smith is the father of economics. He's the first person to think about these things, right? Which sound very modern, very probably you'd say, yeah, that's very intuitive and that makes a lot of sense. But when Adam Smith said that, no one had thought about it in these terms with this clarity, at least. Okay, so typically he's against government interventions because they reduce the size of markets, right? So if you have tariffs and taxes in general, you'll have less businesses, less trade, and that will obviously limit the size of markets and therefore limit the division of labor and limit the wealth of nations, GDP, right? Income, etc. Okay, that's the second point. In one of the chapters, and then Smith goes briefly explains how we eventually settled on gold and silver, starting from all sorts of different experiments. I mentioned corn, okay, on the last slide. But the first kinds of one, or at least one of the first kinds of means of exchange we know of is wampum. And wampum is a shell, right, that you find on the beach. And indigenous tribes would use these wampum shells to mix as a means of exchange, right? People use cows, right, animals, or corn, as I mentioned. And Adam Smith is going to talk about what are it's a brief history of money and what are the properties of money. What is it that makes gold and silver better? Okay, relative to one Pullman cows or corn. There are several aspects. I'm not going to go into it, but if you're interested in monetary economics and history of money, etc., read that chapter more carefully. All right, and finally getting to the labor theory of value, which we've talked about, and you still see the check here on the corner that we just discussed. And the difference between real and nominal prices, which will be the last slide, we'll get there. Then he talks about wages, profit, and rent, which corresponds to the three classes of society. When we talk about classes, you think about Karl Marx, right? The class conflict, and there's the bourgeois and the worker, the boss versus the laborer, isn't it? Employer versus employee, different classes. But actually, and it's true, we'll see again, Marx does use those concepts, obviously, but Adam Smith also, and David Ricardo and all classical economists use classes, okay? But here you see there are three classes. There's the laborer, right? The employee, that is, which receives wages. Then you have the employer, which gets profits. And you have the landowner, which gets rent. Because keep in mind that Adam Smith is still at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So you have a separate class which gets rent, which are the landowners, right? Which is basically the aristocrats and the former elite of society owned basically most of the land, and they would get to rent, right? And the bourgeois or the entrepreneur, the new emerging capitalist, would become capitalist, would pay rent to the landowners, all right? So that would be the third class. So just to say that Smith also uses this division of society in classes. It's just that he doesn't his conclusions are different from Marx, and he doesn't focus on exploitation of the workers or anything. Although, as we've mentioned, his argument about alienation of the worker is very similar to Karl Marx, but in general, he's much more optimistic, of course, about capitalism. Karl Marx said capitalism will self-destroy itself anyway. It's just we just need to wait, and communism is the next inevitable stage of progress anyway. He argued, right? He was wrong. Now we know, unless we're still waiting for it, right? Maybe it will still come. I mean, I'm not sure what the future will be like in 100 years. I'm not here to predict it with a crystal ball, but obviously, so far he was wrong because we're still living, right? We're still capitalism hasn't ended. But either way, obviously, Karl Marx and Adam Smith are worlds apart. But in terms of alienation, they do make the same argument, all right? And both of them do think about society divided in classes. So the fact that you use classes, that you acknowledge that there is the employer and the employee, right? That is the capitalist and the worker, and Adam Smith does recognize these classes, doesn't mean that you're a communist, right? You can be as Adam Smith, right? Well, I mean, Adam Smith's probably one of the main defenders of free markets ever, right? He's basically the first person associated with the invisible hand, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, he sees some functions for the government like public education, but in general, he is one of the most important figures for arguments in favor of market societies, etc. And he uses classes because there's not a contradiction, right? It's just the way society was structured and is structured. Maybe now rent makes less sense to us because maybe it's become more two classes, or maybe it doesn't make sense to think about classes. I mean, let's not get into that, but I guess one main difference is certainly rent, right? We don't have kings and queens and the landowners who own all of the land. There's some of that in Brazil, for example. There's a lot more of that relative to the United States, but certainly capitalism has reached a more advanced stage relative to its very beginning, right? As it was here. Okay. And finally, supply and demand. So these are the first chapters. It's just a note so you see the structure, and so I could make a could give you like a broad like overview of what Smith is talking about in the first chapters, but obviously refer to your syllabus and read the the chapters I'm recommending. Okay, so a few quotations just to give some illustration. Let's go rather quickly through this, but I want to give you a bit of the taste of what Adam Smith is saying. So he says, quote, "It is the same trucking disposition which originally gives occasion to the division of labor. In a tribe of hunters and shepherds, particular person makes bows and arrows, for example, with more readiness and dexterity than any other. He frequently exchanges them for cattle or for venison with his companions, and he finds at last that he can in this manner get more cattle than venison than if he himself went to the field to catch them. From a regard to his own interest, therefore, the making of bows and arrows grows to be his chief businesses and he becomes a sort of armorer." There's a sentence here that you can't see, but basically he's saying, how is it that someone becomes the person who builds, how is it that someone specializes in building bows and arrows, right? So basically there's someone there's a little bit better. It's not that people, we're going to get into this issue right now. Is it nature or nurture? Adam Smith's going to say it's basically nurture. It's not that we're not born very different. We're all pretty much the same, he's saying, just with small differences. So there's someone that is a little bit better, right? Has a bit more dexterity, or a bit better in doing manual labor, a bit better in making bows and arrows. And then what happens is this person that has a slight advantage will specialize in that thing, right? And the fact that a person specializes in doing only one thing will make that person even better and better and better, right? And that's obvious. I mean, the more you practice something, the better you're going to get at that thing, right? There's three, you'll read this in the book, but there are three elements contributing for the increase in productivity due to the division of labor. But one, the most obvious, is if you specialize in something, right, the more you repeat something, the better you become in that thing, right? Okay. Now, nature or nurture? Nurture, he's going to say. So the difference of natural talents in different men is much less than we are aware of. And the very different genius which appear to distinguish men of different professions when grown up to maturity is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the fact of the division of labor. The difference between a philosopher and a common street porter, porter is doorman, okay? That's how they call doorman in Britain. So the difference between a philosopher and a doorman is not so much nature as from habit, custom, and education. The difference of talents comes then to be taken notice of and widens by degrees till at last the vanity of the philosopher is willing to acknowledge scarce any resemblance. So he's saying the philosopher or the scientist looks at the doorman or a person flipping burgers at McDonald's and they go, I'm so smart and I'm an intellectual, right? I'm so much better than that person. Like I was born better. I was born smart, right? And yada yada. Adam's been saying none of that, right? Perhaps you were slightly, maybe he's saying maybe you were slightly better, right? But look, the difference of talents comes to be taking notice of, right? It was very small. You can barely takes notice of. Here you can't see the whole passage because I didn't put the whole passage, but he's going to say, well, when people are very small, so maybe a 3 or go back in time, right? The philosopher and the guy flipping burgers, when they were 2 years old, 1 year old, they're basically the same, maybe slightly different. But when you're 12, maybe there's a little difference. That's what he's saying here, right? That you cannot see. But he's saying maybe when they're 12 years old, that difference starts to be taking notice of, and then it widens, right? Bit by bit until eventually it's very large. And then the vanity, the philosopher has become so vain that he doesn't or she doesn't even acknowledge any similarity at all, right? So very nice that Smith's being humble here, whether you agree or not, that it's nature or nurture, but that's Smith's vision. And it's cool that he was such a prominent intellectual and that he is humble enough to recognize this at least, right? So he's saying nature matters actually much more for dogs. Look how different dogs are from one another. He's arguing. We're not as different from one another really as dogs are, right? One is really fast, one is really strong, one is really sweet, and one is really good at good at hunting. They have very different, maybe we are as different as dogs. You can disagree, but that's what he's saying. That dogs have very different characteristics, right? Physical characteristics that makes them good at different things. And we have some of that, right? Some of us are tall, some of us are shorter, stronger, whatever. But it's not as much as dogs are. So here's the quote. Many tribes of animals, acknowledged to be all of the same species, derive from nature a much more remarkable distinction of genius than what, antecedent to costume and education, appears to take place among men. By nature, a philosopher is not ingenious in disposition, half so different from a street porter as a mastiff is from a greyhound, or a greyhound from a spaniel, or this as from a shepherd's dog. Okay. So, division of labor is limited by the size of markets, and trade makes division of labor possible. Mass consumption. One of the 6 points there that we started with, right? One of the opening chapters of the book. Obviously, it's a big book, and you're just going to read a bit of it, and I'm just going to focus on a few arguments, obviously, right? And tell you um, just a few more, just provide you just complement this point here specifically, the connection between mass consumption, labor, right? Size of markets and division of labor. I want to explain this from a historical perspective, and um, and Smith goes a little bit into that. So in the book, so I'm going to focus on that for the remainder of this lectures. Okay. Um, Now, in this very example of the doorman, okay, the porter, right? He explains that there are quote, there are some sorts of industry, even of the lowest kind, which can be carried on nowhere but in a great town. A porter, for example. So if you have villages, you don't have hotels, right? So therefore you don't have doormen, isn't it? He's basically stating something here very simple. Why is it that division of labor is limited by size of markets? Well, because in the tiny farms and tiny villages and hunter-gatherer societies, you only have a few options in terms of jobs, right? So there's not much of a division of labor. Most families produce everything. They hunt, they do everything they need, they produce their own clothes, right? Eventually, like, how can you be a doorman if you're, or a porter, right? The doorman of a hotel. Um, or think about a restaurant, right? Waiter, the waitress. These jobs only exist if the city gets big enough, right? That the demand for such businesses start. So that's one example why the division of labor is limited by the size of markets. And how did that happen historically? Well, as you may or may not know, through rivers, right? Rivers were the main canal of the evolution of trade in ancient times. And I'll talk a little bit about this. But again, to quote Smith, quote, as by means of water carriage, a more extensive market is open to every sort of industry than what land carriage alone could afford. So it is upon the seacoast and along the banks of navigable rivers that industry of every kind naturally begins to subdivide and improve itself. And it's frequently not till a long time after that that those improvements extend themselves to the inland parts of the country. A broad wheeled wagon, attended by 2 men and drawn by 8 horses, in about 6 weeks' time, carries and brings back between London and Edinburgh near 4 ton weight of goods. In about the same time, a ship navigated by 6 or 8 men and sailing between the ports of London and Leith frequently carries and brings back 200 tons of weight of goods. So quite obvious, right? You have to do the math here, but you get the point. With ships versus carriage, the compare water, okay, water carriage with land carriage. It's quite obvious, right? Especially without trains. He's talking about here land carriage back then without trains, right? So with less people, you can cover a bigger distance and carry a much bigger weight of goods when you compare water carriage. And this idea of how did capitalism eventually emerge, the Industrial Revolution, etc. He doesn't explain in a lot of details, right? As I said, Karl Marx is going to explain this better, and that's our final lecture, and we'll talk about that. But he does hint here at the idea that little by little, through societies start to develop along rivers and along the Mediterranean Ocean, etc., and they will develop trade little by little. If it were by land, it would be very hard. And obviously, there's trade by land, and civilizations also develop by land, but very slowly compared to water. And little by little, we trade, and that will allow a bigger division of labor until right society matures. And then there's a big question mark here. There's a kind of a black box because he doesn't really explain how exactly, right? Like what is the so was this a linear process that starts from the Bronze Age all the way up to the Industrial Revolution, where we trade increasingly throughout the bank rivers and the oceans, etc., until right we develop enough, or was there some historical event that facilitated the emergence of the Industrial Revolution? Adam Smith doesn't explain that, right? He just shows you what the mechanism is, and then, but not the timing of it, right? And if it's a natural process or if there was an external force, like did the state or did anything, did religion influence, did anything else influence with this, or was that just a spontaneous thing, right? Um, we're going to have to wait until Marx to answer that question, or at least to listen to his question answer, because Adam Smith doesn't really explain. But look at this. Think about the commerce between India and London, right? Obviously, they did trade, but by ocean, right? But what if they had to do it by land, right? What goods could bear the expense of land carriage between London and Calcutta? Or if there were any so precious as to be able to support this expense, with what safety could they be transported through the territories of so many barbarous nations? Those two cities, however, at present carry on a very considerable commerce with each other, and by mutually affording a market, give a good deal of encouragement to each other's industry. So, first of all, it's a lot cheaper to navigate, right? So here you can see, follow the mouse here. Obviously, they would go, well, and you'll see, let's see, there's going to be do I have it here? No, I do not have it here. Okay. So I was thinking I had the old versus the new route, but okay, you can see the mouse either way. Um, back at Adam Smith's point, but you'd have to go, well, initially, right, you had to go all the way around Africa by boat from England to India, but now you can go over here, right? So you can see that now ships will go like this way from London through the Gibraltar in Spain, for here Spain and Morocco. So from London they would, or whatever, England, anywhere through the Gibraltar here in Spain, and then into the Mediterranean Ocean, and then out here, right? And then reaching India, which is a lot shorter than they used to do. But even going around Africa, it's a lot cheaper than to go by boat, right? Relative to by land. And on top of that, there's still the danger of going through all of these countries 300 years ago, right? When Adam Smith is writing is not 300, but 250 years ago or something. Yeah, pretty much 150 exactly, because we're about to arrive at America at 250, right? To celebrate in 2 years from now, in 2026, we'll have America celebrating 250 years. And that's the Wealth of Nations from the same year, isn't it? So, yeah. Um, 250 years ago, so 148 years ago, that was when Adam Smith wrote, right? So it would be dangerous to cross. Obviously, in the ocean, you have pirates as well. You know what's happening here right now, right? After the war that we're having here, Israel and in Gaza, you have the pirates that that were attacking boats, etc. here in this region where you can see the malls here. So you do have pirates, you still have them, but still it's easier to protect the ship, than going through land through a mill. Yes, right? I mean, that would. So that's also part of the cost here. All right. So again, how did, Adam Smith is basically saying this, but without getting into the details. But as I said, if you were a fan of of religion, and either it's the Torah or the Bible, the history of Abraham, right, leaving the Babylon and going to Egypt, and then Jews going back to the land of Israel, the whole history there. This is where it begins, right? Civilization begins in multiple places in the world, but one of the places where civilization emerges is here, the Mesopotamia, which means between the rivers. Meso means middle, so middle of Tigris and the Euphrates, right? Mesopotamia, Potamia is like rivers, okay. Okay, so here is where civilization begins with Sumerians and then Babylonia, etc. So before the Exodus, that whole story of the Bible. If you're interested in that, but basically you see the rivers, right? So it's not a coincidence that civilization, one of the first main civilizations, the Sumerians and then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, etc., would emerge from this river, because you see these two massive rivers, and that then yeah. All right. So Adam Smith's talking about that fact, right? You have all the cities here, Uruk, et cetera, the main first cities where in between these two rivers. Today, this is Iraq, modern Iraq, right? Um, all right, so you see here what it would look like more or less in ancient days. So trade, little by little, developing the possibility that different civilizations specialize in different things little by little, and they reach a point of development. We'll talk more about that next time. So here a little bit later, you see after Sumerians was the first at this point here in this region, but after them you had Babylonia, okay, and other kingdoms, Elam, Assyria, Hittites, Egyptian kingdom, etc. Here's modern Greece, right? The Mycenaeans at the time. All right. Just so you visualize, right, the development. And then you had a few exceptions would be the inland empires, but they only managed, right, to develop because they had massive rivers as well. The difference is they had a massive river that was inland, okay. Okay, before I show you this is what I want to get at. Here's the Mediterranean Ocean and all major civilizations. And here, when we studied Socrates, remember that was around 400 BC. This map is 500 BCE. So therefore, 100 years or so before Socrates and Plato. So you see the main ancient civilizations, as I mentioned. Here you see the two the rivers, but all around the Mediterranean, right? The Roman Empire eventually will emerge, of course, Italy, and you had Greek, right? Plato, etc., as I mentioned, around this time here as the golden age, more or less, of Greece. You would have Alexander the Great emerging from here. You could see Egypt here and other civilizations that would be important, right? So they're all more or less around Phoenicia. Okay, you see all the lands, in inland you couldn't develop, right? Around nowadays we've built roads and we have trains that go, railways that go everywhere. But back then, right, 500 BCE, civilization was growing everywhere where there was water, right? Except, not except, it's still water, but the exceptions in the inland empires are Egypt and China, not coincidentally, because look at the river structure of China inland, right? They didn't have the Mediterranean, and they couldn't trade with other countries that were far away, right? The same way we have here, the same way you have here, Phoenicia could exchange with Spain very easily. Also, notice that the Mediterranean is almost completely closed, except for the Gibraltar here, which is here. So that means there's very calm waters, right? There's not lots of waves. It's very easy to navigate and it's cheaper to navigate and faster, etc. Relative to when you go to the if you travel between Europe and North America, for instance, it's harder to navigate relative to here where waters are calm. So those were the exceptions. Here's a passage that is very cool. I mentioned the Gibraltar, which is here. Okay, and in the stories of the heroes, right, of the Greek tragedies, there's this idea. Let me read you the quote. To pass beyond the pillars of Hercules, so it would be this here, okay? That's why the Greeks thought that you couldn't pass beyond this, okay? That's the known world back then. So they were arguing to pass beyond the pillars of Hercules, that is, to sail out of the straits of Gibraltar, okay, outside of the Mediterranean, was in the ancient world long considered as a most wonderful and dangerous exploit of navigation. It was laid before even the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, the most skillful navigators and shipbuilders of those old times attempted it, and they were for a long time the only nations that did attempt it. You see, so just a few people would dare and go out of here, right? So as I mentioned, nowadays we have here in England that boats come in through here and exit on the other side and go all the way through India. But when we're talking about Plato's time, okay, only a few people would dare go out of the Gibraltar, and they were called the Pillars of Hercules. Okay, they would think that after you go out of here, it gets really dangerous, right? And mystical and mysterious, and probably with sea creatures and all of those ancient times history. So just a piece of ancient Greek history here. Okay, so that explains, according to Smith, why in Africa, where you don't have these great inlets, such as the Baltic and the Adriatic seas in Europe, as we've just seen, and the Mediterranean and Euxine seas in both Europe and Asia, and the Gulfs of Arabia, Persia, India, and Bengal, and Siam in Asia. So all of the great rivers, right, in Europe and Asia, etc., that carry maritime commerce into the interior parts of that great continent. And the great rivers of Africa are at too great distance from one another to give any occasion to considerable inland navigation. So we did see the Nile River, right? So the Egyptian Empire, obviously one of the main empires at some point, right? In the Bronze Age, etc. But look how, apart from the Nile River, right, you have a lot of Africa which doesn't have. So there is a big river here. For instance, the Niger River, where obviously you have Nigeria, but it's not connected, see, with Nile River at all. They're very far away. So you can develop a civilization here and another one here, but they cannot trade with each other, right? That's part of why Africa would be stuck relative to other countries in terms of trading and couldn't develop the wealth. So why is it that wealth of nations, right? That's part of the explanation. Okay. So Adam Smith arrived at this idea around the theory of value, thinking about the water diamond paradox. Why is it that water, which is so valuable in the sense that if you don't drink water, you'll die, why is it therefore so cheap, whereas diamond, which doesn't have any practical value, is so expensive, right? Diamond may be beautiful or whatever, but it's not a matter of life or and death, like as water. And obviously, that's thinking about this paradox is where Adam Smith arrives at the idea of labor theory of value, right? Because diamonds have a very limited supply, so you have to dig and you need equipment and tools, and they're hard to find, and yada yada. Right? So the more you have to work for it, the higher the price is going to be. Water, yes, it has this value in the sense that it has value in use, right? So it's useful. Water has value in use. It's useful that you can drink it, but it doesn't have value in exchange. Okay, so there's a difference between value and price. There's two different meanings of the word value: value in use and value in exchange. Water has high value in use. It's very useful, right? But it has very little value in exchange. The price is very little because there's rivers everywhere. You can just go there and collect water, right? So So that's why the price is low. So Adam Smith explains why something that seems more useful than something else is a lot cheaper, right? Depends on the supply, and that's connected with labor, right? The amount of labor that you have to employ. So that's the labor theory of value. Okay, very last point. He makes this distinction between real and nominal prices. Okay, and so the only thing you need to understand here is that there's a difference between the nominal wage and the real wage, right? In other words, I'm saying that the labor theory of value tells you that the price is proportional or a function of the number of hours, right, that people have worked for in order to produce that thing. Fine. So prices are proportional to labor. That's okay. But the point is, your salary, right? Your salary. Imagine you earn $1,000 a month, right? So that's your salary. That's your nominal wage, right? That's the face value of the of money of your salary, right? What you earn is $1,000, but your real wage, on the other hand, is different from your nominal wage because it takes into consideration the prices, right? Inflation level, etc. Imagine that, simple example, imagine that you earn $1,000 per month, as I said, and then suddenly your salary doubles. So now you're going to get $2,000 a month. Oh, are you 2 times as rich as you were? If prices haven't changed, yes. But if the price of everything also doubled, right, then you're equally rich, right? In real terms. In nominal terms, you're 2 times richer than you were, but in real terms, nothing would have changed, right? So as you see from the graph here, there's this difference between nominal wage and real wage. Real wage would be what your money can buy, right? Not how much money you earn, but how many how many pounds of food, how many pounds of meat, how many whatever, right? What is how much can you actually buy with the money you get? That's your real, okay, that's the real value of your salary. So it's taking into account inflation and how prices changed. All right. So if you compare salaries now with salaries 100 years ago, salaries now are a lot higher, right? But prices have also increased. So in order to tell, are we 10 times richer? Are we 2 times richer? Are we 50 times richer than we were 100 years ago? We need to calculate, right? We need to compare the salaries and the salaries increase and the price increase, and then divide nominal wages, your paycheck, what's written on your paycheck, by the general levels of price. So Adam Smith also discusses this and is one of the people who to introduce this distinction between nominal variables and real value variables, and that's obviously connected with the labor theory of value, because if the prices are determined by, right, the amount of time, then you have this notion here. Okay, this is just an important thing for you to understand in general, and that also comes from Smith. So I just wanted to point that before we conclude, and that's about it for today. So I'll see you soon. I'll see you Sunday for Marxist, and which is our final class. Thank you, and see you soon. Have a good weekend.